Japan aims to tell the story of diverse and multi-layered Japan, and to be a platform for Japanese cultural fans around the world to gather and share information. I will focus on the concept of Japan. There are several important Japanese cultural concepts, one of the most important of which is the concept of duality. At the heart of Japanese culture places a standard of duality, heterogeneous players coexistence in harmony. First theme of Kami and Buddhas of Japan is one of such example. Lucia Dolce is a leading scholar in Japanese religious and cultural studies. She serves as a Numata professor of Buddhist studies and Japanese religions at SOAS University of London, School of Oriental and African Studies, and is also the director of Center for the Study of Japanese Religions at SOAS. Taimon Squich is currently a professor at Nichibunken, the International Research Center for Japanese Studies in Kyoto. He specializes in early modern Japanese art and culture. I hope you will enjoy this talk on the theme of Kami and Buddhas of Japan. Thank you.
I thought I will start talking about the relation between Kami and Buddhas from a moment in history that determined the way in which we understand these two entities today. And that is the moment in which Japan opened to the West, so to speak, the Meiji period. The Meiji government issued a number of edicts that changed the name of shrines and of their deities and forbade the presence of anything Buddhist in these places, in these shrines. So this is what goes under the name of the separation of Kami and Buddhas. An event that changed very much the aspect of Japanese religiosity for the 100th century or more, that the 100 years or more that have passed since then. So if there was a need of separating these two terms and deities, it means that they were together before. So I think that this big change in the politics of religion, maybe you would say, is something that makes us that has influenced the way in which we think about the type of religions that characterize today Japan. So we often hear that Japan has 4 or 5 religions, of which Buddhism and Shinto are the most important ones. That Shinto is the indigenous religion of Japan that has continued from since the beginning of the country, and that Buddhism is a foreign import that was adopted in Japan. But this dichotomous way of thinking about religion is quite misleading, and it's misleading not only for foreigners who might have not had a very much familiarity with Japanese history, but also very often for Japanese who are not aware of their religious history because of the lack of religious education in Japanese schools. Another consequence of political history, we could say, after World War II history in that case. So, how do we describe the relation between the Kami and the Buddhas and before this separation, and why is it important? Is it a question of antiquarian history, of reconstructing the past? Or is it relevant also for today, for understanding several aspects of Japan, including those that were mentioned in the introduction, I'm especially interested in the fact that 100 years after the Meiji Restoration, there has been a growing interest in, certainly in Kyoto and more broadly in Japan, for revitalizing the combination of kami and Buddhas, the Shinbutsu Shugo practices. And that may come as a surprise it's a complete change of narrative of the way in which we have represented the Japanese history, but that tells us a lot, maybe not only about the success or the lack of success of Meiji Restoration, but about what is the expectation for this thing that we call religion. So let's think a bit about the religious landscape as it presents itself in a combinatory fashion. And this is the term combinatory, it may be a little bit of a strange English term, is a term that I like to use for, as a translation of Shinbutsu Shugo, of this bringing together the kamis and the Buddhas. So maybe we should start thinking, first of all, about who are the kami? What do we mean with the kami? Kami, this term actually embraces a great variety of entities. We often say that kami are local gods, but not all the kami that are venerated as such are local. Some of them have come from afar, not just within Japan, but even outside Japan, both historically and in the present. There is a lot of variety in type of deities that the term kami brings together. We have element of nature, which is what has brought people to think of Japan as an animistic religion. But we also have deities that are connected to historical the court, the emperor, the politics of the country of Japan. These are kind of elite deities that are not all that much local, in fact. They are part of the myth, they're part of history, but they are very little recognizable by the ordinary Japanese. And then we have a series of deities that are that take different aspects depending on the occasions. One thing that we can say generally is that kami, whatever they were in the imagination of the Japanese before Buddhism entered the country, were not always and not necessarily benevolent entities. They were vindicative spirits. They were, or even when we have natural elements, they were elements to be afraid of, and they needed to be appeased. So that's, I think, an important point to think about the connections also with Buddhism. And we also have to think about what is it, the Buddhism that we identify as the religion of the Buddhas. We are talking about Mahayana Buddhism, a very broad tradition that does not have a single Buddha, but has many Buddhas, many Buddhist systems, many different practices, and that has assimilated many local cults in its journey from India eastwards. So many of the deities that today we think as kami are actually often Indian deities that have come to Japan through Buddhism. And maybe we can think of examples later on. So, how do we think about these the systems that are behind these two terms, kami and Buddhas, and why is it a problem to keep them together? Why was it a problem for the Meiji government, and why is it a problem for us to understand what Japanese religion is? Whether we call it combinatory or we use other terms, maybe we can talk later about other terms that have been applied to this situation. In my opinion, one of the big problems is that is the terminology that we use, especially when we speak in English. So it's a question of language, of a modern language perhaps, which is affected by, or that it has its background in monotheistic religion, where religious system is a closed system, a self-contained system that does not allow for fluidity, for what I would think multiplicity, maybe we can say. But Buddhism is not such a system, for instance. Buddhism is as pluralistic as we can think of the entirety of Japanese religion. So perhaps the adoption or the combination with the local gods was something that came natural to Buddhism throughout, or to the Buddhists throughout their history. I think also it's difficult to say what were the kami, what we call today Shinto, before Buddhism came to Japan. Buddhism brought not only Chinese culture, but also writing system. So the records that we have about religion are, about any religious activities, are not pre-Buddhist. And so it seems that from what we can read in terms of historical records, it seems that there is very little continuity between what we can imagine the worship of the kami was in a prehistorical time and what it became at the moment in which it was written down, it was regulated by the state. So that's another point to think when we consider the indigeneity, the indigenous nature of Shinto. So if we can say perhaps that the worship of kami and Buddhism developed together in a symbiotic way since the very beginning of the written history of Japan. And there were different models of interaction between these two, tradition. I don't want to use the word religion. These were not two self-contained religions, but these ritual systems, I would call them. And it's interesting to think of the different models that were not necessarily one after the other, but there were parallel models of interactions. The kami were represented very early on as human beings, as beings that needed to be liberated, to be saved. They were just like human beings on their way. They were suffering and therefore needed to be led to Buddhist liberation. And there are a lot of stories of encounters of monks with the kami, where the kami asks to be converted, what we would say today, to be converted to Buddhism in order to achieve a better state of life. And in exchange for this, the kami would offer protection to Buddhism as an institution. So, for instance, to temples, to the construction of new temples, or to the opening of new territories to Buddhist monks. That's a very important model that we find early on in history. One of the most famous kami, very important kami that even moved to the Kinai area is Hachiman, a deity that originally is local to Kyushu, that at the moment of the construction of a temple called the Todaiji in Nara, offered protection to Buddhists. Another interesting model of combination is is perhaps more sophisticated, and it sees the kami as skillful means of the Buddhas in order to spread Buddhism. So they are, there's a word in Buddhism, hoben in Japanese or upaya in Sanskrit, which means that they are, maybe we can say, they're used by Buddhas and Buddhas, I mean all the deities of the Buddhist pantheon, in order to make people understand this very complicated doctrine that is Buddhist. There is an expression that is used very much in pre-modern works, that is that of soften, that indicates the kami as those who soften the light of the Buddhas and merge with the sand, with the dust of this world. So it's kind of interesting. The kami keep on being represented as beings not transcendent, not of another world. They live in a world that is not visible, but is contiguous with that of human beings. And the Buddhas become represented more and more as entities which are distant and that need to be brought closer to the Japanese, to those who wrote these narratives, let's say. And finally, there is a third model that I want to talk about that is perhaps maybe we can call it a philosophical model of combination that is perhaps particularly developed in Japan more than in any other countries in which Buddhism tried to relate itself to local cults. And that is a model that sees the kami as equal in substance, as ontological equal to the Buddhas. We can say an alter ego of the Buddhas, and sharing the same characteristics as the Buddha, being the traces of the Buddhas on this. In this life, on this planet, in this country, actually. I said it's a sophisticated system because it implies an understanding of reality that sees the Buddhas as having an existence that is an absolute existence, but also a relative existence that becomes visible, that becomes instantiated in other beings, in the traces, right? It is this idea of the kami as equal to the Buddhas that actually has produced an extraordinary amount of visual representations where the kami appear as kami, but at the same time as Buddhas. And these are also paintings called mandalas, kami mandalas, Shinto mandalas, Miya mandalas. There are different names for these artifacts. But I think they are interesting because it show how the kami and the Buddhas can be interchangeable. They can be seen as doubling each other. So you can have, for instance, you can have the deity of Kumano, very important area, not so far from Kyoto, in the south, towards the south of Wakayama Prefecture, where which is is a very important shrine. The deity is a local deity. But in many representations, it appears as the Buddha Amida, that it's considered the Honji, that is the original essence of this kami. This interchangeability, however, is also feasible, is possible, because the kami themselves don't have a fixed appearance. I was saying that there is a lot of fluidity in the way in which we define the kami, but also in the way in which we see them. And another example, perhaps, is that of the deity that today is considered at the top of the Shinto pantheon, that is Amaterasu, the sun goddess. The sun goddess is not really a local god, right? Is the ancestral deity of the imperial family, and that is why it has assumed such a big importance in Japanese history. According to the myth, again, myths that were written, that were written early in history. Amaterasu is a female deity. Very strange to have the sun as a female deity across cultures, but is a female deity. But if we look at visual representations, we see that in many of these representations, it's also represented as a male. So we can have Amaterasu as a courtier, as a male courtier, as well as a female deity. We see Amaterasu represented as a doji, that is a young Buddhist deity, an assistant kind of deity. There is a doji that is well known for rainmaking, for the ability to produce rain. And this is called Huho Doji, and that is how Amaterasu was also represented. There were several statues about that. And we have Amaterasu represented as a Buddha. Another Buddha, I mentioned Amida, but what we have with Amaterasu is the Buddha Dainichi, the Buddha of the esoteric system. So this kind of instability, we can say, of the kami allows multiple views about who they can be and who they can be associated and what they can be associated to. I also think that it's important to look at how the ritual for the kami, since that is the main aspect of the cult of the kami, is at the same time distinct from Buddhist and from Buddhist rituals, and at the same time close to it. We have, if you think of the ritual apparatus, what are the prayers that are presented to the kami and motivations for doing these rituals. We have a set of gestures and things that are used, ritual tools that you identify immediately as belonging to the kami today. The gohei, the norito, and yet we also have a lot of kamis inside, enshrined inside temples, towards whom monks, that is, representatives of the Buddhist world, would pay homage, using the gohei sometimes, or using other elements of the kami world, but also using Buddhist prayers. And in fact, historically, sutras were read in front of the kami, perhaps because the kami were understood as people who needed to be liberated, and therefore the reading of the sutras would help them to go towards a Buddhist path. And again, historically, many sutras were copied and donated to shrines as a donation to the kami. And ritual is interesting because even today, I mentioned earlier on that there has been a movement of revival of the combination of kami and Buddhist. And of course, it's not possible anymore to bring back the kind of pre-modern situation. The places of the kami, what we call shrines, are completely separated institutions today and are run differently from Buddhism. Whereas in the past, we have what scholars call temple shrine complexes that shared not only the physical space but also the administration, where shaso, monks that were in charge of the worship of the kami, would take care of the kami. So we can't go back to that. But interestingly, we can, or this is what they have done, what the shrines are doing at the moment, is to offer again to their kami rituals that are of combinatory nature. For instance, the reading of the sutras, or the debating of the message of the sutra in front of the kami. That was a very important rite in the pre-modern period to appease and entertain the kami. So this is a ritual called Rai-hai-ko. There have been a number of these performed even in Kyoto shrines. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, that makes us think about the combinatory nature of Japanese religion being no longer or no more, not necessarily a question of historical development, right? I have a bit more time. I wanted just to make one more point about the language that we use for indicating the relation between kami and Buddhas. And a word that has often been used to translate the Japanese of Shinbutsu Shugo, which is anyway a kind of not very old term, has been syncretism. And when I was invited to give this talk, the word syncretism was in the title of it. I quite dislike this word, because syncretism implies a complete absorption of one system that is considered minor, that is considered a weak system, into another that is more important. And so there is a kind of vertical relation of power between these two religions when a syncretic movement is created. In a sense, you could say, oh, well, but you have told us about Buddhism being, creating narratives for Shinto, or explaining who the kami are from a Buddhist perspective. But in fact, the relation between the kami and Buddhas is not really syncretic, because syncretism implies that once the two are fused, they become a single entity. But that is not what happens with the kami and the Buddhas. They maintain their diversity, while at the same time they can be one. So this idea of being one and yet two, which is in a sense philosophically a very Buddhist idea, is perhaps what characterizes the relation more than what syncretism can indicate. That's why scholars have kept using terms that are perhaps more neutral, such as combinatory, that just as they are put together without the judgment of value. And this is also what makes us think about the fluidity of Japanese way of thinking, the possibility of being not just in one way, but being at the same time two different entities. And with this, I think I'll conclude. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so I've been asked to interrogate Professor Dolce, ask some questions for about 10 minutes, and then all time for you to ask questions. And I think, yes. So let me begin by just saying thank you very much for very clearly identifying this rather forgotten fact. And many people in this room, I think, are Japanese, and you may not be aware any more than foreigners are aware that when we see a shrine and we see a temple, quite often, especially in a country town where there's only one shrine and one temple, they're next door to each other, and there's a wall between, and that wall wasn't there until Meiji. Until Meiji, they were one thing. And so all kami are, as you said, desperate, like us, to escape pain and suffering, and they can't escape pain and suffering through their own system. They do that via the Buddhas, right? I'm not trying to put words into your mouth. You might contradict what I said, but the Buddhas, of course, are somewhere else. They can't easily interfere in this world. If you have a toothache, if you want to get a good job, if you want to get your daughter married, then there's not much point in praying to a Buddha for that, because they aren't here. Right? Whereas you can very well pray to a kami for that. And when I used to teach in London, I never taught the history of religions as Lucia did. I was teaching students who weren't so deeply involved with it. But I used to say it's a bit like in Christianity, God and the saints. Right? If you have a toothache, if you want to get your daughter married, if you want to get more money, there are saints you can pray to do that. The saints can perform miracles. They can even bring people from the dead. But it's not their own agency that do it. They do it because they've been seconded power from somewhere else. And the kami are a little bit like that, in my view. Now, you always criticize. Of course, Meiji came along and completely overturned that. And one reason I think why today Japanese people, if asked, more Japanese people than any other nation in the world say they believe in nothing, right? Because Meiji so destroyed faith patterns, or ritual patterns, as you might say, that Japan never really got back to it. And then, of course, the Second World War further undermined people's understanding of these things. So anyway, that's just my little gloss on what you said. But to ask you to respond with a few questions, you talked a little bit more about the how the kami were part of Buddhism. What about how Buddhism was part of the kami? Because after all, today, if you go to most Buddhist temples, you do still find shrines in them. Of course, you don't find little Buddhist icons in shrines anymore. So the Meiji division was only one side was kind of purged, right? So
yes and no. Well, it affected the shrines more because the intention of the government, of the Meiji government, was to create Shinto, to invent Shinto, to use the word that a British diplomat who was in Japan at the time used. Basil Chamberlain even wrote a little booklet called The Invention of a Religion, and it's really interesting to read what he had to say. He was kind of going around shrines and asking we're talking at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, asking the shrine priests, what is your religion about? And nobody was really clear about how to define this thing called Shinto. So that tells maybe the, that asks you what Shinto was not before. It was not a religion, self-contained, and it was not a system of belief that had clear doctrines that could be explained to a foreigner who was identifying a religion with a set of tenets, basically, and a specific differentiated way of thinking. But that, of course, was a problem for the shrines. So the Shinto was created, if we want to use this word. It was invented as an independent religion. That was not a problem for the Buddhists, because the Buddhists didn't need to eliminate the kami from their own their own ritual context, unless they were imperial kami. By that time, Japan was speaking about an empire, and so, for instance, places or objects that had Amaterasu, and actually also Hachiman, as part of a Buddhist world, were asked to be destroyed. I was mentioning earlier on the mandalas, and there are some other kinds of paintings that we call mandalas, although they are not exactly what a mandala is. That, for instance, those used by the Nichiren Shu, that had inscribed Amaterasu and Hachiman inside, and there was a specific edict issued to all temples of the Nichiren Shu to destroy their honzon, their main object of worship, because Amaterasu could not be part of the Buddhist world. So that there was this kind of need to separate, to create a cult that focused on the emperor. But that does not mean that those shrines or that kind of Shinto that was created in the Meiji period was a religion, actually. It was what we call it often a civic religion. It was kind of was a space and a way of being citizens rather than all the things that you mentioned earlier on, to pray for your own well-being or your family well-being. That was not the main, certainly not the main aim of the shrines created in the Meiji period. So Buddhism keeps on practicing a lot of rituals for the kami and keeps housing in main hall even. Often the side altar you have the protective deities, and because this action of protecting the place and protecting Buddhism, it's so important. It was important. It's still understood as an important aspect of the activities of the kami. I think, they are kept in temples because of that as well.
And as you suggested, that in fact before Buddhism even got to Japan, it had passed through so many countries where it had absorbed a whole lot of these things already. So that, if, of course, you all know, you go to a temple, there's Nannaishin with the word kami, Kongo-chin, and all these loads of things. And Chinese Buddhism, which doesn't have Japanese kami, also has a whole pile of, I think Burmese Buddhism has nuts, which are somewhat similar. So
similar.
Just,
Benzaiten, everyone would consider Benzaiten a kami. It's venerated as a kami, with the apparatus of a kami. As a shrine, it is connected to all sorts of arts and crafts, but Benzaiten is an Indian deity, very important Buddhist deity per se, right? So it's
Well, there's still one temple in Kyoto, in fact, in Fushimi, right? Benzaiten.
There are plenty of temples. So there is one inside the imperial palace.
Really?
Dedicated to Benzaiten. Very important. Yes.
The palace in
here in Kyoto. Well, inside the grounds. Yes. They do. I mean, I have seen. They do just so-called Shinto rituals. So they do a kagura. They do all sorts of activity. Ritual activities that today we associated to kami. I don't want to say Shinto, but yes, to Shinto today, really.
And then when, I've done a little bit of work on the arrival of Christianity into Japan, some Namban period and things, when, of course, the Christians turned up and they couldn't understand why the Japanese couldn't understand that a religion is a religion, and you can't have both, right? And so the Jesuits were always baptizing people, which they took to mean conversion, and the baptized Japanese continued having all their other cults. And sometimes even fusing that Maria Kannon is just, one case. And of course, the both sides didn't get across what they thought was going on. But
actually, I want to contradict a bit you there because you mentioned earlier on saints. And actually, I think if you read some of the records of the Jesuits, I thought that they understood pretty well the combinatory nature. They speak about the combination of kami and Buddhas as a pretty normal thing. And I always thought that the reason is that they were Catholic, they were not Protestant, so they did have a variety of deities, if I can say so, inside their pantheon. And so they could grasp enough of the ambivalence of this world. Don't forget that it was not Shinto as Shinto at that time, right? Yeah. So it was a kind of combination there. But certainly, the problem is with us. The problem is with the monotheistic perspective that has also determined the language that we use. So that's why I'm so hesitant in defining and using this or the other terminology for this connection, for this relation.